Cape Cod has its fair share of historic homes. They're all over the place. Being that this is one of the oldest European settled areas in the United States, it's only natural that there are homes dating back 300 or more years all over the Cape. The Cape is also known for its shoreline change and erosion, unfortunately, especially over the last century. Beaches erode away. Some beaches actually accrete, get bigger. Race Point and the southern tip of Monomoy Island have actually gotten bigger over the last 20, 30 years. And despite this knowledge that the shoreline is always changing, people have this dream of living out in the sand dunes. If you go up to Provincetown, there's the dune shacks of the peaked hill bars. It's a long walk to get out there to these dune shacks. That'll be covered in a future podcast. It's a rarity when a historic home out in the dunes and the shoreline change all come together. So this is going to be a look back at one of the most famous homes, I guess you could call it a home, ever on Cape Cod. It became so famous that it had its own book written about it. So this is a story of a home called Forecastle, better known as the Outermost House, and it became famous in the book written by author Henry Beston. The story of Henry Beston and the Outermost House begins in 1925. He was a struggling author, and he purchased 50 acres of beach about 2 miles south of where the Coast Guard station is in Eastham, if you're familiar with Coast Guard Beach. He asked a neighbor named Harvey Moore to build a small 2-room shack out in those dunes. It was 20 feet by 16 feet. It had a bedroom and a kitchen/living room. A well was dug, and then an outhouse was dug, and Henry Beston had his own little hideaway way out in the dunes, 2 miles south of Coast Guard Beach. And that's way out there. Google Maps, look it up and see how far it is. Henry Beston was born in Quincy and began visiting Cape Cod when he was young to visit friends. He stayed at a lot of places down there, but had a cottage on Salt Pond in Eastham, which basically would overlook where Forecastle would be built. So after World War I was when Beston came to the Cape with this desire to get away from it all. The lingering effects of being in World War I and being a struggling author, he needed something to kind of recharge his batteries. His intention was only to stay at Forecastle in 1926 for about 2 weeks, but he loved it so much out there and he got this creative inspiration that he ended up spending an entire year out there alone with his thoughts in the dunes between 1926 and 1927. And he wrote several notebooks worth of material, but Beston, it was basically just like a journal, and he had no intention of making it into a manuscript, but his hand got forced. So in 1927, he left Forecastle. He proposed to his girlfriend, who was an accomplished writer named Elizabeth Coatsworth. And it turns out that Elizabeth believed in him and believed in his manuscript so much that she basically drew a line in the sand and said, no book, no marriage. So he cultivated his collection of notes into a book called The Outermost House. The reason that he gave it the title The Outermost House was Beston believed that his shack out on Coast Guard Beach was the outermost in the eastern United States. The book was published in October of 1928, and Henry and Elizabeth were married in June 1929, so it all worked out. The book was a moderate success. It was released through Doubleday and Doran, and it was Beston's 8th published book. The initial sales were good, so he went to Europe to promote it, and in the first few years after publishing The Outermost House, Beston would routinely come back to Forecastle in Eastham and rekindle his love of the beach, while he also lived in Hingham. Beston and his family, Elizabeth and their 2 daughters, would eventually move up north into Maine. They bought a parcel of land called Chimney Farm in the town of Noblesboro, Maine in 1931, and by 1933, they had permanently relocated up there, so his visits back down to Forecastle were few and far between. But what came of Forecastle after Beston left and moved to Maine? So in March 1931, a large nor'easter slammed Cape Cod and destroyed 2 cottages out on the Eastham Dunes and pushed another into the Nauset Marsh. So Forecastle wasn't the only dune shack out there. It was just seen as the furthest one out, outermost. And another storm came in January 1933 and washed away so much of the beach that Forecastle, the house, was only 7 feet from the edge of the bluffs. Beston was concerned from up in Maine, but they moved the house back so it was safe. But the years passed and the erosion continued. The erosion rate out there at Coast Guard Beach is an average of 3.3 feet per year, and that's based on data from 1865 to 2015. So this isn't just a recent thing. We're talking 150 years, and that's an average. That's not counting big storms, and we'll get to that because that kind of was what did in Forecastle. So during the summer of 1948, the Outermost House was moved back 200 more yards from the water, and it was reinforced and re-shingled to protect it. And the funny thing is that when they moved the house back, they actually turned it. So when Henry Beston came back and visited later on, it didn't face the way that he remembered, and he actually joked that somebody had moved the ocean. Beston may have grown distant from Cape Cod, but he still remained connected. He retained ownership of the Outermost House throughout the 1950s. And though he was rarely there, he allowed friends to stay there. And in 1959, he donated the shack and the 50 acres that he still owned to the Massachusetts Audubon Society. And in 1961, the National Seashore was created. And 3 years later, in 1964, Forecastle was designated a National Literary Monument by the United States government. On October 11th, 1964, Henry Beston Day was celebrated at the Cape Cod National Seashore in conjunction with the Audubon Society. This would be Beston's last trip to Cape Cod and his last viewing of Forecastle. He died April 15th, 1968, only a few weeks shy of his 80th birthday. And his death renewed interest in the Outermost House. So by this point, the Outermost House, Forecastle, was over 60 years old. And so people started doing the hike out there to see it and gaze upon it. In doing research for this piece on the podcast, I found a lot of photos people took of Forecastle during the 1970s, especially on Flickr. A lot of people on that site have their own personal photographs up there. And it's good that people got these photos because it was something totally unforeseen that spelled the end of Forecastle. Between February 6th and 7th, 1978, one of the most historic blizzards in the history of the country caught the region mostly by surprise. The blizzard of 78 tore through New England, but especially hit hard was the Outer Cape. The high tide of 16 feet tore through the Outer Cape, briefly making the area north of Fort Hill in Eastham an island. Coast Guard Beach was just destroyed. There was a 350-space parking lot that collapsed and forever changed the way the beach was viewed. And if you want to learn more about the blizzard of 78, I covered it more extensively in episode 9 of the podcast. But basically what happened was the Outermost House was claimed by the sea. It was pulled out into the ocean and pushed back into the marsh, which essentially tore it to pieces. There was nothing left. Sadly, Forecastle was claimed by the very sea that Henry Beston romanticized in his book. And there are no remains. There are pictures, and you can actually see pictures from the blizzard of 78 when it got destroyed. But since 1969 alone, Coast Guard Beach has lost over 300 feet of shoreline, meaning that where the Outermost House was originally built, way back in 1926, is way out in the ocean now. Luckily, the Outermost House book itself is available widely everywhere. You can get it on any website that has books, any bookstore, and check out henrybeston.com, which is an excellent all-encompassing website about the author's life. And with spring arriving, get out there and enjoy the beaches because the shoreline is always changing. Here today, gone tomorrow. Did any of you ever get to visit the Outermost House, Forecastle, way back? It's been gone for 43 years, but I don't know if anyone visited it. Anyone read the book? The book is great, but that's a brief history of the actual Outermost House, Forecastle, which used to reside in the dunes of Eastham.